Welcome to MontagsRadioCommunique. I'm Montag. Thank you so very much for listening and downloading. This is episode number 1. Topic for this episode is the JFK assassination. Excerpts from the Torbit document, NASA, Nazis, and JFK. Forward by David Hatcher Childress. New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison once said, President Kennedy was murdered by elements of the industrial warfare complex, working in concert with individuals in the United States government. At the time of his murder, President Kennedy was working to end the Cold War. The annual income of the defense industry was well over $20 billion a year, and there were forces in that industry and in the U.S. government which opposed the ending of the Cold War. In 1970, a photocopied manuscript began circulating amongst conspiracy researchers entitled Nomenclature of an Assassination Cabal by William Torbit, a pseudonym. The Torbit document was a damning expose of J. Edgar Hoover, Lyndon Johnson, John Connally, and Wernher von Braun, among many others, for their role in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. This first published edition of the Torbit document emphasizes what the manuscript says about the link between Operation Paperclip Nazi scientists working for NASA, the Defense Industrial Security Command, the assassination of JFK, and the secret Nevada air base known as Area 51. The Torbit document reveals the roles in the assassination played by NASA and Munitions Police, the little-known DISC, Defense Industrial Security Command, an organization headed by Wernher von Braun. The Torbit document tells how the assassination was carried out by J. Edgar Hoover's elite Division 5. The FBI's Division 5 investigated both the JFK and Martin Luther King assassinations, finding only evidence for lone nut assassins. The Torbit document tells how the Las Vegas mob and shadow corporate entities such as Permindex and Central Mondiale Comerciale were involved, and how the FBI cooperated with the mafia to create the crime and later cover it up. The Torbit document links the same assassination cabal to the failed 1962 assassination attempt on President Charles de Gaulle of France. Torbit tells how de Gaulle traced the assassination from right-wing French Algerians to Permindex in Switzerland and NATO headquarters in Brussels. Other damning accusations in the Torbit document are on how Lyndon Johnson, John Connally, Clay Shaw, Wernher von Braun, and British intelligence were tied to the assassination plot, and how the assassination cabal planned to blame anti-Castro groups or Castro himself if the lone nut version failed. Indeed, the Torbit document paints a dark picture of NASA, the military-industrial complex, and the connections to Mercury, Nevada, and the Area 51 complex, which headquarters the secret space program. The role of the FBI and the military-industrial complex in the assassination of JFK has long been underestimated, while the role that the CIA played in the assassination may have been overestimated. There seems to be no doubt that the CIA played an important role in the cover-up and planning of JFK's murder. H.R. Haldeman, President Nixon's chief of staff, who went down with the Watergate scandal, wrote in his book The Ends of Power about the Watergate tapes. In all of those Nixon references to the Bay of Pigs, Nixon was actually referring to the Kennedy assassination. The CIA literally erased any connection between Kennedy's assassination and the CIA. In fact, counterintelligence chief James Angleton of the CIA called Bill Sullivan of the FBI and rehearsed the questions and answers they would give to the Warren Commission investigators. Another FBI agent, Dallas resident James Hosty, was the agent in charge of Oswald's case at the time of the assassination. According to the Warren Commission, on November 6, 1963, Oswald wrote a note to Hosty, which Hosty later ripped up and flushed down the toilet, under the orders of FBI Office Chief J. Gordon Shanklin. On the 1988 British television documentary The Men Who Killed Kennedy, Hosty said, "I feel there was, based on what I know now, a benign cover-up. The government was concerned about Oswald's connections to the Soviet Union and to Castro. One of the most curious episodes in the JFK thing was that of Canadian businessman Richard Giesbrecht, who overheard David Ferry discussing his role in the assassination with another man at the Winnipeg airport on February 13, 1964. Giesbrecht overheard Ferry talking several times about a package coming from Nevada. Later, the other man mentioned Mercury as the location where various contacts of one sort or another had taken place. Mercury, Nevada is not known to most Americans, but it should be. It is part of NASA and is where the astronauts were trained for the Apollo moon missions." Chapter 1. Permindex and its 5 subsidiaries. The Defense Industrial Security Command had its beginnings when J. Edgar Hoover, in the early 1930s, organized the police force of the fledgling Tennessee Valley Authority at the request of David Lilienthal. The police force covered the entire TVA, or Tennessee Valley Authority, from Knoxville, Tennessee through Huntsville and Florence, Alabama, and into Kentucky and back through the eastern portion of Tennessee into southern Kentucky. This was one of the first federal agencies with a separate police force. This force grew, and Lilienthal took it forward to cover the Atomic Energy Commission, thus tying it into the Army Intelligence Service. L. M. Bloomfield, a Montreal, Canada lawyer, bearing the reputation as a sex deviant, the direct supervisor of all contractual agents with J. Edgar Hoover's Division 5, was the top coordinator for the network planning the execution. A Swiss corporation, Permindex, was used to head 5 front organizations responsible for furnishing personnel and supervisors to carry out assigned duties. The Defense Industrial Security Command is the police and espionage agency for the U.S. munitions makers. DISC was organized by J. Edgar Hoover. William Sullivan, his chief assistant, is in direct command. We shall later examine the involvement of a large number of the DISC agents, including Clay Shaw, Guy Bannister, David Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, and others, with Permindex's Louis Mortimer Bloomfield of Montreal, Canada, in charge. Werner von Braun had been decorated more than any other Nazi during World War II. Hoover had worked directly with von Braun in connection with NASA's security since his arrival in the United States in December 1945. Lyndon Johnson, as vice president, was chairman of NASA, and he, von Braun, Bobby Baker, Fred Black, had worked diligently to obtain the $9 billion Apollo contract for North American aviation in 1961. NASA awarded this contract to North American despite the fact that it went against the recommendation of its own Source Evaluation Board. Each of the NASA security personnel who were assigned duties in connection with the assassination were employees or contractees of Division 5 of the FBI, and many were connected with the other 4 groups. George de Mohrenschildt, a Russian immigrant who refused to join the Solidarists and who was familiar with the working of espionage groups and who had worked with them in the past, testified that J. Edgar Hoover, using Division 5 of the FBI, was the planner of the assassination of President Kennedy. Through de Mohrenschildt's testimony before the Commission and his documentation, the connection of the espionage section of the FBI with the assassination has been established. De Mohrenschildt, in retrospect, knew that Division 5 of the FBI and the Solidarists had intended to use him as a scapegoat along with Oswald, and he did not hesitate to name the small group within the FBI as the instigators of the assassination of President Kennedy. Concerning the Solidarists, Jack Ruby was a second-generation immigrant from the White Russian area of Poland, and his brother Hyman Rubinstein was born there. Ralph Paul, Ruby's Dallas partner in the Carousel Club, was a Russian immigrant having been born in Kiev, Russia. Another organization participating with Division 5 was a religious group called the American Council of Christian Churches. ACCC's West Coast representative, E. E. Bradley, was indicted by New Orleans grand jury for complicity in the assassination. Hoover was joined in the cabal to murder President Kennedy by Lyndon Johnson, Walter Jenkins, Johnson's assistant, Fred Korth, whom Kennedy had fired as Secretary of the Navy 2 weeks before the assassination, H. L. Hunt of ACCC, Jean de Menil, Houston multimillionaire, head of Schlumberger, and a director of the Russian exile Solidarists, Carlos Prio Socaris, ex-Cuban president and longtime gambling partner of Jack Ruby and director of the anti-Castro Cubans, Bobby Baker, ex-Senate secretary, Roy M. Cohn, New York attorney and head of the Jewish League Against Communism, Clifford Jones, ex-lieutenant governor of Nevada, Democratic National Committeeman and business partner with Bobby Baker, and L. J. McWillie. L. J. McWillie of Las Vegas, Nevada, a partner in Havana gambling with Ruby and Jones, L. M. Bloomfield of Montreal, a longtime friend and agent of J. Edgar Hoover, Ferenc Nagy, ex-premier of Hungary, Werner von Braun, German Nazi rocket engineer, whom Hitler personally decorated for his work slaughtering over 7,000 allies during World War II, John Connolly, and Clint Murchison. Clay Shaw, the defendant in the New Orleans assassination case, and L. M. Bloomfield of Montreal, Canada, were the only North American members of both the board of directors of Permindex and Central Mondiale Commerciale. Shaw had been one of the incorporators of the Swiss corporation Permindex. The other members of the board include a publisher of the fascist National Zeitung in West Germany, an Italian industrialist who married into the family of Adolf Hitler's finance minister, and a woman lawyer, the secretary of the fascist party. Also on the board of Permindex was Ferenc Nagy, a solidarist and prime minister of Hungary from 1946 to 1947. George Mandel, alias Mantello, a Hungarian fascist who supervised attempts to purchase national monuments for real estate development in Italy, and Munir Shurbaji, an uncle of King Farouk. Both firms being directed by the same men, the stated corporate purpose was to encourage trade between nations. Their actual purpose was fourfold. Number 1, to fund and direct assassinations of European, Mideast, and world leaders considered threats to the Western world and to petroleum interests of the backers. 2, to furnish couriers, agents, and management in transporting, depositing, and rechanneling funds through Swiss banks for Las Vegas, Miami, Havana, and international gambling syndicates. Number 3, to coordinate the espionage activities of the Solidarists and Division 5 of the FBI with groups in sympathy with their objectives and to receive and channel funds and arms from the financiers to the action groups. Number 4, to build, acquire, and operate hotels and gambling casinos in the Caribbean, Italy, and at other tourist areas. The principal financiers of Permindex were a number of U.S. oil companies: H. L. Hunt of Dallas, Clint Murchison of Dallas, John Demenil, Solidarist Director of Houston, John Connolly as executor of the Sid Richardson Estate, Halliburton Oil Company, Senator Robert Kerr of Oklahoma, Troy Post of Dallas, Lloyd Cobb of New Orleans, Dr. Eckner of New Orleans, George and Herman Brown of Brown and Root, Houston, Attorney Roy M. Cohn, Chairman of the Board for Lionel Corporation, New York City, Chemley Industries of New York City, Walter Dornberger, ex-Nazi general, and his company Bell Aerospace, Pan American World Airways, its subsidiary Intercontinental Hotel Corporation, Raygor Rodsky of Dallas through his company Claiborne Oil of New Orleans, Credit Suisse of Canada, Heineken's Brewery of Canada, and a host of other munitions makers and NASA contractors, directed by the Defense Industrial Security Command. It should be noted here that John Connolly, Paul Regorodski, and Jean de Menil were close friends and business associates. Among Connolly's assigned duties was the keeping of Texas police agencies in line after the murder. John Connolly was an active participant in the assassination plans, but he was one of the agents whose overall knowledge was limited by the need-to-know basis. L. M. Bloomfield, a lawyer of Montreal, Canada, and a longtime friend and confidant of J. Edgar Hoover, had been Hoover's contract supervisor of Division 5 since his days in the OSS before World War II. Bloomfield held one-half of the shares of Permindex and was in total command of its operation in Europe and Africa, as well as North and South American continents. He was the coordinator of all activities, responsible only to Hoover and Johnson in carrying out the plans for Kennedy's assassination. Bloomfield ordered Permindex's Ferenc Nagy and George Mandel to the United States in 1962, where they helped to supervise the plans. Mandel was assigned to the Los Angeles, California area. Ferenc Nagy, former premier of Hungary, settled in Dallas, Texas, where he contacted H. L. Hunt, Igor Voshinin, George Buba, Peter Gregory of Fort Worth, Paul Regorodski, and other members of the Solidarists, and took command of actual planning in the Southwest. It should be pointed out that although the White Russians were dominant in the Solidarists, it contained East Europeans, Jewish and Orthodox Christians, and even Arabic nationals whose countries had been taken over by communism. Nagy, in Dallas over the month before November 22, 1963, worked with Carlos Prio Socaris and Alex Carlson in Miami, Clay Shaw in New Orleans, John Demenil in Houston, Clifford Jones and L.J. McWillie in Las Vegas, Bobby Baker and Fred Korth in Washington, D.C., Albert Osborne of Texas and Mexico, Roy Cohn of New York City, and others, all under the direction of L. M. Bloomfield in making the plans and preparation. On November 22nd, Osborne and about 10 of his riflemen were living at 3126 Harlandale in Oak Cliff, a section of Dallas. 3 of his professionals were at Tammy True's house in Fort Worth, and Leon Oswald, alias William Seymour, had been at the Oak Cliff address about 4 weeks. Before dark on November 23, 1963, Osborne, Seymour, Gonzalez, and the other riflemen were out of Dallas. This is the way John F. Kennedy met his death in Dallas. At the top were Johnson, Hoover, Bloomfield, Nagy, Demenil, Prio, Jenkins, Hunt, Baker, Jones, McWillie, Von Braun, Cohn, Korth, Connolly, and Murchison. L. M. Bloomfield was in overall charge, responsible only to Hoover and Johnson. The second layer participants, with supervisory and working assignments under Bloomfield, and the first group were Walter Dornberger, ex-Nazi general, Guy Bannister, Albert Osborne, E. E. Bradley, Morris Dallas, Major General John B. Medeiros, Robert McCune, Igor Voishinin, George Buhi, Peter Gregory, Morris Gatlin, Sergio Aracha Smith, Lee Harvey Oswald, William Seymour, David Ferry, T. Gonzalez, Manuel Garcia Gonzalez, Leighton Martins, Gordon Novell, Walter Sheridan, William Dalzell, Paul Regorodski, Joe Bonanno, Alex Carlson, George Mandel, Brock Wall, Clay Shaw, Joe Cody, Jake Kozloff, Mike McClaney, Ruth and Mike Payne, Igor Vaganov, Jack Bowen, Mike Ryan, Tammy True, Max Cherry, Patrick Hoy, David Holy, James Powell, and a number of others with limited assignments, informed only enough to carry out the assignments with dispatch. After the Bay of Pigs disaster, the Ruby Group, under Bannister's direction, continued to work with the Cuban exiles toward an invasion of the Cuban mainland. Bannister, as a free agent, worked with Warren DeBreeze, Division 5 of the FBI's resident agent in New Orleans. DeBreeze was also a White Russian and a member of the Solidarists. DeBreeze's chief assignment in the summer and fall of 1963 was to maintain close vigil over Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans and Dallas. This he did, and after Oswald's death, Debris gathered all of Oswald's personal belongings and carried them to J. Edgar Hoover in Washington. On November 22nd, before it was known that Kennedy was dead, Warren Debris walked into Parkland Hospital and tried to force his way into the room where President Kennedy was being attended. Two Secret Service agents had a terrible fight with Debris before he was subdued in the room just outside of Kennedy's. He was held down by Secret Service agents until help arrived. Lee Harvey Oswald was recruited into Division 5 of the FBI by David Ferrie in 1956 before joining the United States Marine Corps. Oswald was taken to Memphis, Tennessee by Division 5 of the FBI while in the Marine Corps. There he received the highest level of covert espionage activities training during June, July, and August of 1957 at the Naval Intelligence School located on the Memphis Naval Base. The school is of such a highly secret nature that Oswald's official Marine Corps records were doctored so as not to reflect his training there. Lee Harvey Oswald was paid by J. Edgar Hoover through a subterfuge account with the Department of Immigration and Naturalization, a division of the Justice Department, and consequently he could testify before the Warren Commission without being technically guilty of perjury that Oswald was not on the FBI payroll. Oswald was tutored by the Solidarists on the Russian language and his duties as an FBI espionage agent. The Russian newspapers and literature which Oswald received were of Solidarist origin. In 1959, Oswald admitted his connections were white Russians. George de Mohrenschildt, with his long years of experience in intelligence roles, testified to facts connecting Lee Oswald and Max Clark and his wife Gailey to Division 5 of the FBI and the Defense Industrial Security Command through the Henry Crown, Patrick Hoy-dominated General Dynamics. He further revealed the name of the Division 5 agent in charge of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The actual assassination was done by a team of highly trained professional assassins from Mexico. These men blended in well with some of the anti-Castro Cubans under the direction of the Free Cuba Committee, with members in Mexico City, Dallas, New Orleans, Montreal, Miami, Chicago, Kansas City, and Los Angeles. The highly trained expert professional riflemen from Mexico were selected from 25 or 30 of the most proficient firing experts in the world. The group of 25 to 30 professional executioners have been based in Mexico and have been used by espionage agencies of the U.S. and various countries all over the world for political killings in the past 25 years. The Free Cuba Committee, anti-communist Russian Solidarists, American Council of Christian Churches, and Division 5 of the FBI obtained the team of the world's best Mexican riflemen through the offices of the Double Check Corporation, an American-based subsidiary of Permindex, the FBI and CIA-funded Swiss Corporation, and Centro Mondial Comercial, also known as World Trade Center Corporation, another FBI and CIA-funded corporation which moved from Rome to Johannesburg, South Africa in 1962. Both of these corporations have been used by J. Edgar Hoover to fund the 1961 and 1962 assassination attempts on Charles de Gaulle. Clint Murchison and J. Edgar Hoover were closer than twin brothers at the Del Charro Hotel, adjacent to Murchison's horse race tracks at La Jolla, California, over the 10 years preceding the 1963 murder. Hoover fraudulently charged over $40,000 of his personal bills at Del Charro to Delhi Taylor Oil Company, a Murchison corporation. From 1953 through 1963, J. Edgar Hoover and Clint Murchison met constantly at Del Charro, with Johnny Drew, John Connolly, Joe Bonanno, Carlos Marcello, and other Mafia officers. As a matter of fact, the Mafia was in partnership with Murchison, John Connolly, and Hoover in Boys Inc., the front organized to avoid taxes in operating Del Mar horse racetracks. Connolly, as governor of Texas in 1967, refused to extradite Sergio Arracha Smith to New Orleans and was thus carrying out his principal role in the plan. Carlos Marcello, mafia boss of Louisiana and Texas, worked with his fellow mafia commissioner Joe Bonanno in carrying out the assassination. Bonanno and Marcello met at Del Charro and other points to discuss personally and make decisions of middle responsibility. David Ferry was an employee of Carlos Marcello before and after the assassination. Ferry, Alvin Bobeuf, and Melvin Coffey immediately went to the Alma Hotel in Houston. The motel was owned by Marcello and the Mafia. Bobeuf and Ferry made at least 3 phone calls from the Texas Gulf Coast on November 22nd and 23rd to the Townhouse Motel in New Orleans. The townhouse is also owned by Marcello and the mob. Bonanno, Marcello, and the Mafia were all working directly under the Defense Industrial Security Command through their ownership of controlling interests in the large number of companies engaged in manufacturing munitions, hardware, and supplies for the Pentagon, Space Agency, AEC, and USIA. Jack Ruby was one of Marcello's men in Dallas for a number of years. In June of 1963, Ruby spent about a week in New Orleans conferring with Marcello and other members of DISC. The Warren Commission investigators uncovered the Ruby New Orleans trip and revealed his constant visits to the Show Bar in the French Quarter. The Show Bar was owned by Marcello and the Mafia. Giada Conforto, a stripper at the Show Bar, was sent by Marcello to Jack Ruby's place in Dallas about 1 month before the assassination. Giada left Dallas on November 23, 1963, but returned after Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Joe Bonanno and Carlos Marcello were both on the ruling commission of the Mafia and were in constant business contact. They were very close friends as well. However, their actions covered here were in the relationship to their connection with the Defense Industrial Security Command. Joining Hoover, Carroll, Murchison, the chiefs of staff, and the mafioso, along with others on the ruling committee of DISC, was the Nazi Werner von Braun in his capacity as head of the space agency. John Connolly had served with the ruling group of the Munitions Makers Policy Agency during his term as Secretary of the Navy. Connolly had been over the Office of Navy Intelligence through Permindex and Centro Mondial Comercial and its functions. Marcello and Bonanno are easily connected with Clay Shaw, J. Edgar Hoover, the DIA, the DISC, the gambling syndicate and its Miami, Bahama, and Swiss financial conduits, the assassination attempt on de Gaulle, and the entire personnel of the Kennedy death planners. From the evidence gathered by the Warren Commission, it is reasonable to believe that one of these highly trained Mexican professional assassins fired the fatal headshot from behind the fence at Dealey Plaza. This was the last bullet fired at the time of the assassination of President Kennedy, and it is one which struck him from the right front, blowing off a large portion of the right front temple and constituting the coup de grace. However, at least 7 of the Mexican professionals were in firing position in Dallas on November 22nd. 3 of the Mexican assassins stayed at Tammy True's house in Fort Worth while waiting their assignment. Tammy, one of Jack Ruby's strippers, allowed them to stay at Ruby's request, and they left for the return trip to Mexico on Saturday, November 23rd. Early during the New Orleans investigation, Jim Garrison questioned one of Osborne's professionals, who was one of the 3 who stayed with Tammy True. Emilio Santana was the assassin firing from the Daltex building across Houston Street from the depository and behind President's car. Santana confirmed many of the facts herein. He went on to admit his close acquaintance with Jack Ruby, Clay Shaw, Gordon Novell, William Seymour, and the others. As a matter of fact, Santana told of a close relationship between Ruby and Shaw. This and other facts gathered by Garrison were corroborated by a host of other witnesses closely associated with the professionals. Santana confirmed that he had been employed by Clay Shaw. He further related that Jack Ruby and Shaw made a number of long trips together, and one of these trips took the traveling companions to Cuba in 1959, where they visited McWillie and the gambling casinos to work out details in their arms smuggling assignments. In the meantime, Guy Bannister, FBI Division 5 Southern Director, employed a long-term employee of Double Check by the name of William Seymour from Phoenix, Arizona. Seymour was the same size and weight as Lee Harvey Oswald and, more importantly, by his resemblance to Oswald, was as that of an identical twin. Seymour was given the name Leon Oswald and false identification papers in such name, as well as the name Lee Harvey Oswald and others. William Seymour, alias Leon Oswald, then proceeded to impersonate Lee Oswald at a number of places in New Orleans, Florida, Austin, Fort Worth, and Dallas, Texas, right down to November 22nd, 1963. As per his assignment through Bannister from the cabal, Seymour made incriminating statements on behalf of Oswald, which were to be used as evidence against Oswald after the murder. Seymour also went to Florida posing as Oswald and carried the Fair Play for Cuba part down there in the summer of 1963. Seymour, in his masquerade, bought ammunition in Fort Worth, made pro-Castro remarks in an Irving barber shop and other shops around Dallas, and fired a rifle similar to the Italian one a large number of times and at a number of rifle ranges in the Dallas area over a month's period immediately before the cabal's murder occurred. 2 weeks before the assassination, Seymour, alias Lee Harvey Oswald, alias Leon Oswald, told a car salesman he would soon come into a huge sum of money. As Leon Oswald, Seymour, in September 1963, discussed the planned assassination of Kennedy in New Orleans with Clay Shaw, David Ferry, and 2 Mexican men. On November 22nd, William Seymour fired a rifle from the 6th floor of the school depository building at President Kennedy, striking him only once in the back. 2 of his shots missed, and the one that hit Connolly came from the building across Houston Street from the depository building. Seymour left the building and was picked up by a Nash Rambler. The driver took Seymour to the vicinity of the Abundant Life Temple and left him out to walk the balance of about 2 blocks to the temple, an affiliate of the ACCC, which was provided as a safe house for Seymour. He killed police officer J.D. Tippit and then proceeded to his safe house, the Abundant Life Temple, about a block from the Tippit murder scene. There he remained until it was safe to leave town. On November 22, 1963, Ferenc Nagy appears in more than 35 photographs at the site of the assassination. He is shown with an open umbrella at a point to the right of President Kennedy's car at Dealey Plaza. After the president's car passed within a few feet of Nagy, he suddenly closed his umbrella and the last and fatal shots were fired. He is depicted in pictures after the shots with his umbrella folded and then departing the area. Nagy is easily recognizable in a number of photos taken by bystanders. Nagy's forward area of cranium is fully bald, while the back 1/4 portion is covered, and the hair is combed across the back section of his head. Nagy, the former Prime Minister of Hungary, President of Permandex, and upper echelon boss of Division 5 of the FBI, along with Clay Shaw and L.M. Bloomfield, carried out their assignments in Dallas with dispatch. Von Braun, immediately upon arriving in the United States, made close personal friends with J. Edgar Hoover and Lyndon B. Johnson, and the relationship remained close with Von Braun working with Hoover in security in the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Redstone Arsenal, and later, beginning in 1958, they worked together in the security of the National Space Agency. 1958 was that year that Lyndon Johnson, as Majority Leader of the Senate, helped push through the National Space Act, and later, when he became Vice President, he was made Chairman of the National Space Committee. Werner von Braun first met Clay Shaw in 1945 when he, Walter Dornberger, and about 150 other Nazi rocket scientists abandoned Peenemünde and traveled south to join the American forces in Germany close to the French border. Von Braun, Dornberger, and Shaw maintained the relationship over the years through their mutual connection with the Defense Industrial Security Command, an operational arm of the Counter-Espionage Division of the FBI. After 2 years of intense and extensive investigation, Jim Garrison made a well-recorded public statement showing beyond doubt that he had traced the Nazi rocket scientists, the World Trade Center, and Permandex, the fascist Solidarists, American Council of Christian Churches, Free Cuba Committee, the Gambling Syndicate and Mafia, and NASA's Security Division, into its umbrella controlling organization, the Defense Industrial Security Command of Columbus, Ohio, and Huntsville, Alabama. Garrison had traced DISC into its larger umbrella, Division 5 of the FBI, and the Defense Intelligence Agency, supervised by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon. Chapter 11. Clay Shaw, Permandex Director, plans a murder. Clay Shaw, under the name Clay or Clem Bertrand, was overheard planning the assassination of President Kennedy with David Ferry and Bettit, alias Leon Oswald, during the middle of September 1963 in New Orleans. New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison produced a witness who told a three-judge criminal district court panel on March 14, 1967. He heard Lee Harvey Oswald, Clay Shaw, and David Ferry plotting to assassinate President John F. Kennedy. Perry Raymond Rousseau, 25, an insurance salesman from Baton Rouge, testified he was in Ferry's apartment in New Orleans in September 1963 and listened to a discussion of how to kill Kennedy and make a getaway. Rousseau said the plot involved triangulation of crossfire, diversionary shooting, and the sacrificing of one man as a scapegoat to allow the others to escape. Under questioning by Garrison, Rousseau said Oswald was introduced to him as Leon Oswald and Shaw as Clem Bertrand. Shown a photograph of Garrison, Rousseau identified Leon as Lee Harvey Oswald. Asked if Clem Bertrand was in the courtroom, Rousseau pointed to Shaw. Rousseau testified that Ferry, 49 years old, a freelance pilot who was under investigation by Garrison at the time of his death, did most of the talking about the proposed assassination. Ferry, pacing the floor, said the attempt should have 3 gunners in order to provide a triangulation of crossfire. Rousseau testified. He quoted Ferry as saying that one man would have to be sacrificed as scapegoat. Ferry, Rousseau added, was to be the getaway pilot flying into Mexico to refuel for a flight to Brazil. Objections were raised by Bertrand, Rousseau said. He said Bertrand argued that as soon as the shots were fired, the world would know about it, and once the plane landed in Mexico, there would be no way to get out. During the 2 years in which the Shaw case was pending, and at the ancillary proceedings and final trial, J. Edgar Hoover furnished Shaw's defense with witnesses, investigators, and propaganda. Without the immense effort by J. Edgar Hoover on Shaw's behalf, there is little question that the prosecution probably would have succeeded. Chapter 12. William Seymour, agent for the Defense Industrial Security Command, participates in a murder. William Seymour came out of the rear of the depository building about 15 minutes after the assassination. He ran around the building and across Dealey Plaza to enter a car and take flight. Gordon Novell, the other fabricated Oswald, has been shown to have been elsewhere at the times in question. All of the following is taken from the Warren Commission evidence. A witness, J.R. Worrell, at the time of the shooting was in the general area across Elm Street from the depository building. He saw the gun being fired from the 6th floor window, but did not get a look at the man who was firing. After the shooting, Worrell remained in the vicinity for a while and then proceeded across Elm Street, continuing straight ahead and traversed to the east side of the depository building along Houston Street. Shortly after he arrived at the rear of the depository building, a man Worrell identified as Lee Harvey Oswald hurried out of the rear door to the first floor of the depository building, ran to the west corner of the building, and turned to the south, disappearing behind the west side of the depository building in the direction of the Dealey Plaza lawn and Elm Street. Seymour and the dark-complexioned driver vanished into the same underpass the stricken president passed through, and Seymour remains at large. At 5:30 p.m. the same day, Roger Craig, went to City Hall where Lee Harvey Oswald was being questioned and identified Oswald as the man running across the lawn who entered the Nash Rambler automobile. At the time that Roger Craig saw the person whom he thought to be Oswald, and who in fact was Seymour leaving the scene of the assassination, Oswald was taking a bus and a cab to his room in Oak Cliff. The Commission found this to be so, and the evidence sustaining the whereabouts of Lee Harvey Oswald at this time is substantial. Oswald left his rooming house, and the Commission found he killed Dallas Police Officer Tippit about a mile from the room. Although there is compelling evidence that someone else killed Tippit, the Commission cited sufficient evidence to sustain their conclusion. At approximately 1:15 p.m., Tippit, who was cruising east on 10th Street, passed the intersection of 10th and Patton about 8 blocks from where he had reported at 12:54 p.m. About 100 feet past the intersection, Tippit stopped a man walking east along the south side of Patton. The man was bushy-headed and stocky-build. Tippit stopped the man and called him to his car. The bushy-headed man approached the car and apparently exchanged words with Tippit through the front right or vent window. Tippit got out and started to walk around the front of his car. As Tippit reached the left front wheel, the man pulled out a revolver and fired several shots. The bullets hit Tippit and killed him instantly. The gunman started back toward Patton Avenue, ejecting the empty cartridges and leaving them to later inculpate Oswald. It appears that the first and principal red herring in the present case was Lee Harvey Oswald. The various actions of Oswald, Seymour, and Novell were designed to lead anyone looking at them to take the actions as all being the actions of Oswald, and thus lead the investigators to believe Oswald was the perpetrator in the assassination of President Kennedy and that he was acting alone. It further appears that the second and substitute red herring was to go into effect only in the event it should be discovered that a conspiracy existed. The various connections of Oswald with the pro-Castro organization and Seymour with the anti-Castro Cubans and others was likely designed to lead a false trail of evidence to suspects other than the person or persons responsible. Chapter 13. Conclusion. In letters smuggled from jail, Jack Ruby constantly said the Nazis and fascists were behind the Kennedy murder. Ruby was much more knowledgeable about the conspiracy than most. John F. Kennedy's last executive order stated that 1,000 troops would be brought home from Vietnam by Christmas 1963. The dispatch reported this would leave 11,000 non-combatants in Vietnam, all of which would be removed by the end of 1964. Thus, in his official last act, the slain president evidenced his opposition to involving ourselves in the Southeastern Asia civil wars. Less than 1 year after Kennedy's death, responsible senators reported the Johnson administration staged a false incident in the Tonkin Gulf. The U.S. went to war. The munitions makers and their police force, the Defense Industrial Security Command, were well paid. Next are 3 short audio clips. The first is Mac White discussing the JFK assassination on From the Rabbit Hole in 2010. Following that will be Randy Owens from X Zone Radio. And finally, clip by Mae Brussel on the 10th anniversary in 1973.
Roderick McKenzie, Rod, is a guy that's up in his late 70s whom he's only been interviewed 3 times. He claims to have been an insider in the plot to kill JFK. He had a low-level function with regard to the plot. He didn't know what he was involved in, and the story that he tells is that he had known and worked for these mobsters, Sam Giancana in Chicago and John Roselli, people who were involved, again, with that whole Bay of Pigs gang, with the plots to kill Castro, and then later, apparently, with the plot to kill Kennedy. He was involved in all this activity back and forth with Cuba and so forth, and just various mob and CIA-related operations. And in the course of doing that in the early 60s, he got to know all these people, the Oswald, David Ferry, Guy Bannister, that whole New Orleans crowd, and then, of course, later in Dallas, Jack Ruby, and Tippit. He knew these people, and he describes that what happened was that in 1963, a couple of months before Kennedy was killed, he was given the assignment to go to Dallas, where he was met by Tippit, the policeman who was later killed by someone, they say by Lee Harvey Oswald, but it's not clear. But that at any rate, Tippit introduced him to the people there at the Carousel Club and Jack Ruby and so forth, and he was given his job, which was to manage a safe house in the Dallas area. And he says that there were several safe houses. This is a huge operation, the plot to kill Kennedy. Several safe houses to, places where people, the actual shooters, for instance, could live with, undercover and not be seen and so forth. And in addition, he was a master forger, and he had done, jobs of this kind for a number of years, and says he was trained by the Army in this skill at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Quite a story there. He says by under the auspices of the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. Anyway, he says that he was the guy who basically manufactured the phony Secret Service ID that people were flashing there in Dealey Plaza in the minutes after Kennedy was killed. There are many reliable reports of people running up on the grassy knoll to see what happened, because the shots apparently came from there, and encountering men who flashed Secret Service ID and told them not to worry about it, go away, which they did. But come to find out, the Secret Service says that they had nobody up there. So this was the guy who manufactured the ID. Well, in addition, the mob and / CIA put him to work at one of the local hospitals in Dallas. He also, among other things, was a registered nurse. He had been trained as a nurse by the Army during the Korean War. So his job at the hospital was to, he was working originally at Baylor Hospital, where apparently they expected Kennedy to be taken after the shooting, but he was taken instead to Parkland Hospital. He believes that had he been working at Parkland, he would have been given the job to put the bullet on the stretcher, a famous episode there at the Parkland Hospital after Kennedy was killed. He says he knew the guy, Mac Wallace, who was a character who worked for Lyndon Johnson. He was basically LBJ's personal hitman. That's the allegation. And in fact, Mac Wallace has been implicated for years in numerous mysterious deaths that happened in Texas that have been linked to Johnson. And in fact, that was proven in a court trial in the 80s, that the operation was overseen by Cliff Carter, and that Mac Wallace was one of the shooters in the Schoolbook Depository, and that Mac Wallace, in fact, was in charge of all of the shooting teams in Dealey Plaza. Dorothy Kilgallen is an individual who wasn't a witness to anything related to the Kennedy assassination, but she was a reporter. And, of course, in the 50s and early 60s, she was well known at that time as being a panelist on the game show What's My Line? Well, but she was also a reporter. She had a gossip column, and, well, she managed to get an exclusive interview with Jack Ruby in the jail in Dallas. And afterwards, she was telling friends and associates that what she had discovered about the Kennedy assassination was going to blow it wide open. She said it was going to be huge. And she had amassed a great deal of research. She was about to come forward with it, and then, guess what? She dies of an apparent overdose, suicide, they say, but nothing about it adds up, according to anyone who knew her. And that's not the only one. The night after Ruby killed Oswald, two reporters went to Jack Ruby's apartment, and they had a long conversation with Ruby's roommate, George Senator. And one of those was a reporter with the Dallas Times-Herald, and I can't remember now what the other reporter was affiliated with, but at any rate, those guys had this long interview with Ruby's roommate, and they never got to publish or to anyone's knowledge, say what they discovered, but they both ended up dead within about a year after that.
To give your listeners a little bit of a history lesson, one of the things that was a thorn in JFK's side was the whole situation in Cuba when Fidel Castro took over in 1959, and boom, Cuba became a communist country. There were plots to kill Fidel Castro. The CIA was involved in these plots along with the mafia. And some people thought years afterwards, after that information came out in the 70s, that maybe these plots might have backfired. But Joanides was involved with a group of Cubans called the DRE, the Student Cuban Directorate, and DRE is their acronym in Spanish, DRE. And he was involved in funneling money from the CIA to this Cuban group of exiles that were based in Florida and in other parts of the southern states. Fascinating thing about the DRE is that they had a confrontation with Lee Harvey Oswald about 93 days before Kennedy was shot. Oswald was in New Orleans at the time. He advocated that the United States get their hands off Cuba, leave Cuba alone, let Castro develop his country the way he wanted to, which was a very unpopular position to take back then. And he got into a scuffle on the street while he was handing out some Fair Play for Cuba literature with members of this organization, the DRE. And again, this is the group that George Joanides was, who was working for the CIA, was funneling money to. He was also involved Joanides was at the JM Wave Station, which was a CIA base at the University of Florida, University of Miami, I believe it was. It was the largest CIA base in the world, and here it is right on domestic soil, U.S. domestic soil. So Joanides was involved in that and might have been involved in some of the propaganda that came out within hours of the assassination, false stories linking Oswald to Cuba, that sort of thing.
Who do you think killed President Kennedy, and why?
I think why is probably might lead you back into who. I think from all the research I've done, it boils down to this. I think somebody wanted to kill Kennedy, make it look like Castro might have been involved, blame a patsy on the assassination that you can link to communism, perhaps to Russia, but most likely through Cuba, and have Castro blamed for the assassination. Make it look like Castro was behind it. So, I mean, I've talked to a Secret Service agent by the name of Abraham Bolden, who was in Chicago, the first black agent on the White House detail. As a matter of fact, Kennedy put him there, but he went back to Chicago after a while. Bolden describes a plot in Chicago that involved 4 Cubans who were planning to assassinate Kennedy, and this was about 20 days before the assassination. And yet, after the assassination, all that information was gathered up by the agent in charge, and they were told never to discuss it. So it seems like the CIA knew something, or the Secret Service knew something was going to happen. And there's evidence of, FBI warnings. There were a lot of warnings going on before Kennedy was killed that something was going to happen.
Good afternoon. This is Dialogue Conspiracy. The week is November the 19th, 1973, and this is program number 127. It's 2.5 years of Dialogue Conspiracy on KLRB. This week, in a few days, marks the 10th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. His own family, the only description I can use for them is disgusting. Their main concern, his widow, is to erect an expensive library in his memory where you'll look at his rocking chair and his books, and in the meantime, Camelot gets destroyed, his goals piece by piece. The wings are pulled off like you see a bud, torn apart, legs and limbs, and the family sits by and watches this. His brother is the Attorney General, kept undeveloped pictures from the National Archive. Instead of putting in the archives or turning them over to the Warren Commission and demanding they be developed, he kept them undeveloped when a proof of more bullets in the president's body than the Navy doctor said was possible, and they were in his personal possession. A generation, according to John Kennedy, was supposed to go forth armed with what he referred to as truth and justice and peace in this world. But America, 10 years later, was capable of none of these things. It has been a continuous decade of lies, injustices, and continuous wars. We slumped to the lowest place of the dung heap of nations. In my mind, we will be known as the decade of murders and assassins all over the world, instigated by the same people who killed John Kennedy. I didn't begin to study who killed John Kennedy for any personal reason that I thought he was perfect. I was a registered Democrat in those days. I wouldn't support the Democrats now because there is no Democratic Party. There's just one party in Washington, and it's called the Military Industrial Party that Eisenhower warned us about. The Democrats are so infiltrated with agents you can't tell one from the other, and I stopped being a member of the Democratic Party. I did go see John Kennedy in the Coliseum in Los Angeles the night of the acceptance speech when he was nominated. I happen to be Jewish. My family is Jewish. My 5 children are. And when Jack Ruby went into the Dallas jail and killed Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin of John Kennedy, on November the 24th, 1963, Ruby was asked right away, why did you do it? All the members of the police department knew Ruby, and Ruby was very proud of what he did. He thought he'd be a hero, and he made the remark, I did it to prove a Jew had balls. Well, that statement worried me. I didn't know what Jack Ruby meant. In a few days, I realized through the media that in Dallas, Texas, I knew right offhand that Dallas, Texas was the home of commercial anti-Semitism, large amounts of money from H.L. Hunt or Clarence Mannion, the extreme right wing, comes from the Dallas area. And I know about the broadcast, the anti-Semitic, the anti-black propaganda. And here is Ruby, a Jew, in the anti-Semitic community, trying to show them he's a hero. 2 days after the shooting, there were bumper stickers out and headlines, Oswald was a communist and Rubenstein, the Jew, killed him. Ad that was paid for in the Dallas newspaper that day, 1/3 of the ad was paid for by Lamar Hunt, the son of H.L. Hunt, and the Birch Society wrote the ad, and the men who brought Bernard Weissman to Dallas, Texas were part of the U.S. Army intelligence group that had been working together in Germany and came to the Dallas-Fort Worth area on time for a riot or spitting at Stevenson's face a few weeks earlier, and then they got involved in the Kennedy assassination. Oswald's role of communist was a CIA cover played up by Army intelligence agent Ed Butler, who works for Schick Razor and ballpoint pens for Patrick Frawley. That was a cover. So through all of this, the communist, the Jew, there was an effort to discredit and lump these people together as the reason for the assassination of John Kennedy, that the communist conspiracy was behind it. The anniversary of Kennedy's death, I greet with a combination of emotions, which I thought I would share with you because I feel that what goes through my head is a little bit different than most people's in this country. There were about 10 of us in the United States who, the week of November the 22nd, became what you would call serious researchers that started that week and stayed with it ever since. There's been hundreds of new ones that have picked up since that time. But the 10 of us have worked very, very hard on trying to find out who was doing all these murders and how they got out of town, what places they stayed at, how the news media covered up, how many bullets there really were, who picked up the bullets. And we've cross-filed endless hours and years of work. There was Maggie Fields in Los Angeles. None of us knew each other. Originally, we were each in our own separate little homes, but eventually we got to all connect and meet, at least by telephone and correspondence. Mark Blaine in New York, Shirley Martin in Oklahoma, Sylvia Mayer in New York, Joe Justine in Germany, and Patrick Buchanan from France, Penn Jones Jr. in Texas, David Lift in Los Angeles, Leo Savage in New York, Vincent Salandria in Pennsylvania, Harold Weisberg in Maryland. Those were the basic researchers that have really done a lot of extensive work. Jack Ruby said to these men, it was June the 7th, 1964, Mr. Belli, that's his attorney, evidently didn't go into my case thoroughly or circumstantially. If he'd gone into it, he wouldn't have tried to vindicate me on an insanity plea to relieve me of all responsibility. Had Mr. Belli spent more time with me, he would have realized not to try and get me out completely free. I wanted to get on the stand and tell the truth what happened that morning. And he said, Jack, when they get you on the stand, you're speaking of a premeditated crime. And I said, I don't care. I want to tell the truth. He begged Earl Warren, get me to Washington. It's very important. I don't want to evade any crime I'm guilty of. This isn't the place to tell you, but I want to tell you, I'm not afraid. My life is in danger here, he said. Not the plea of execution, but I want to tell you what happened. The only thing I want to get out to the public, and I can't say it here, is with authenticity, with sincerity, why my act was committed and why it can't be said here, why he shot Lee Harvey Oswald and why it couldn't be said in the Dallas jail. And Earl Warren said, well, if you think it's not safe to talk, if you're in danger of your life, feel free to say the interview is over. And Ruby said, well, what happens then? I didn't accomplish anything. And Earl Warren said, no, nothing was accomplished. And Ruby said, then you won't follow up with anything further? Earl Warren said, there wouldn't be anything to follow up. Ruby said, well, you have the power to do what you want to do without limitations. And Warren said, we have the right to take the testimony of anyone that we want. And I wouldn't have bothered to come to you. He said, if your sister hadn't told me, so you're free to refrain from testifying if you want. So Jack Ruby said, okay, if it takes my life to say this. This is Volume 5 of the Warren Commission hearings. He said, if it takes my life to say it, Earl Warren, unfortunately for me, I'm giving the people the opportunity to get in power because of the act I committed. And has put a lot of people in jeopardy for their lives. You can get more out of me, he said. Don't break up so soon. I'm in a tough spot, and I don't know what the solution can be through certain falsehoods that have been said about me to other people. The Birch Society, I'm as good as guilty as the accused assassin of President Kennedy. A certain organization wouldn't be so completely formed now, so powerfully to use me, because I'm of the Jewish extraction and Jewish faith, to commit the most dastardly crime that has been committed. I wish our beloved President, Lyndon Johnson, see, he trusted him in those days, would have delved deeper into the situation. Hear me, not to accept the circumstantial facts about my guilt or innocence, and would have questioned to find out the truth about me before he relinquished certain powers to these certain people. A whole new form of government is going to take over the country, and I know I won't live to see you another time. This is Jack Ruby, and Gerald Ford was in the room when he said that. If you don't give me a chance and take me back to Washington tonight and give me a chance to prove to the President that I'm not guilty, you'll see the most tragic thing that will ever happen. Maybe something can be saved. Something can be done. Right now, I want to tell you this. I'm being used as a scapegoat, and there's no greater weapon than you can use to create falsehoods about some of the Jewish faith, especially the terrible, heinous crime of the killing of President Kennedy. Now, he said, maybe something can be saved. This is in June '64. If I'm eliminated, there won't be any way of your knowing. You have lost me, though. You have lost me, Chief Justice Warren. I won't be around for you to come and question me again. You are the only one who can save me. I think you can, but by delaying minutes, you lose your chance. And all I wanted to is tell the truth. And that is all. And Earl Warren left Jack Ruby, and Jack Ruby was murdered in the Dallas jail. He started to get injections, and his sister came and found him all bloated up and said, I've got to get my brother to a hospital. And they said, well, she wanted her own private doctor. They said, no, if you're going to call your doctor, we'll use the doctor at Parkland Hospital. They sent Jack Ruby to Parkland Hospital, and 3 weeks later he died of a massive cancer. The coffin was sent to Chicago, where he was buried with orders that if the undertaker opened it, he'd be murdered. A 3-week massive cancer they never had before in his life, and no indication or growth, medication, X-ray. Jack Ruby begged Earl Warren. He said a whole new form of government would come in, that I was used by these people, and lives would be lost. So now it is the end of Camelot. It's 10 years later. The government did take over. Ruby was talking to the government. Earl Warren is part of that secret team that keeps the people from knowing the truth, and so was Lyndon Johnson, but Ruby didn't know it. He worked on a need-to-know basis like the Cubans at the Watergate Committee, Mr. Sturgis or Gonzalez or Martinez, who thought that they knew who they were working high up, but they didn't know how high up they went into the Ellsberg doctor's files and robbed there. Jack Ruby was pleading with Earl Warren because he thought he wanted to know the truth. Earl Warren said, I can leave. I don't even have to speak to you. I wasn't even going to come out. And Ruby said, a whole new form of government will take over. And I want to tell you before that happens, because I won't be alive till tell you. And Earl Warren walked out, and Gerald Ford walked out, and they didn't want to know what Ruby knew, and Ruby was killed. And therefore, part of the plot involved not only the killing of John Kennedy and the killing of Officer Tippit in Dallas, Texas, and the shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald in the Dallas jail by the Dallas police friend Jack Ruby, but then the subsequent murder of Jack Ruby. And the story of history, no matter how many people they kill, the story of history isn't in the National Archives. The law of compensation, Emerson's law of compensation, will take care of those assassins, even if they're White House today and part of the espionage team. The truth is that history has judged them, and the law of compensation is working. It will work on them whether we get them to admit their deeds or not. Okay, our time is up, and I'll see you next week on Dialogue Conspiracy.